You want to hear a story? Then listen closely because this is not a story for the faint of heart. This is a story about music, about talent, about the pursuit of perfection. But it is also a story about fear, about pain, and about a darkness that never truly fades. If you listen carefully, you might even hear it. The echo of voices long silenced, carried by the waters of Venice. The choir of the drowned. It started, as these things always do, with a body. A young woman floating face up in the Grand Canal, her arms spread as if welcoming some unseen embrace. I remember the way the early morning light caught the water, turning it into a sheet of rippling gold around her lifeless form. The gondolier who found her was still trembling when we arrived, his voice barely above a whisper as he muttered prayers under his breath. And then there was the smell, that brackish mix of salt and decay, something that would cling to my skin long after I left the scene. She was beautiful, in that tragic way the dead often are, pale, untouched by the filth of the canal, her hair fanning out around her like ink spilling into water. It wasn't until we pulled her onto the dock that we saw it, the long, deliberate incision at her throat, stitched shut with an almost surgical precision. Not crude, not violent, precise, controlled. I crouched beside her, my fingers brushing against the dampness of her dress. That was when I noticed the markings. Thin, delicate cuts along her collarbone, forming something I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. I leaned in closer. Notes. Musical notes. The realization hit me with a force that made my stomach twist. Someone had carved music into her skin. And worse, when the medical examiner arrived, lifting her chin ever so slightly, the full horror of it became clear. Her vocal cords were gone, cut cleanly from her throat, removed as if they had never belonged to her in the first place. The others didn't see it at first, too caught up in the grotesque artistry of the scene. But I saw, and I knew. This was not just a murder. This was a performance, and I had seen the rehearsal before. You don't understand, not yet, but I do. Because once, a long time ago, I was supposed to be one of them. I had been just a child when I first stepped into the Conservatorio della Voce Celestiale, the most prestigious music academy in Venice, a place where only the most gifted young singers were chosen, where talent was sculpted with the precision of a master craftsman. Or broken. That was the way of Maestro Lupo. He was a legend, a man whose name alone could make or destroy a career. And he knew it. We were his instruments, his choir of perfect voices, meant to carry his music to heights no one else could reach. But perfection comes at a price, and some paid more than others. Some were pushed beyond their limits, their bodies and minds stretched until they snapped. And those who failed, they simply disappeared. I was lucky, I suppose. I was never good enough. I remember the moment I knew I would never belong among them, the final audition, when my voice failed me at the worst possible moment. The note I should have hit, the one that should have secured my place among the prodigies, wavered, just enough for the maestro's expression to turn from expectation to disappointment, just enough for him to shake his head and look away. I was dismissed, forgotten, and I thought that was the end of it, until now. Because the woman in the canal wasn't just anyone, I knew her face. Her name was Alessandra Moretti, and she had once been one of us. The investigation began as they always do. Questions, witnesses, a search for connections. But I already knew where it would lead, to the academy, to the past, to the ones who had survived. Alessandra had been one of the maestro's stars, a voice so pure it could bring an audience to tears. But that kind of talent came with expectations, with pressure, with secrets no one wanted to talk about. And now she was dead, her voice stolen, her body turned into a twisted kind of sheet music. She wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. I could feel it, deep in my bones, the way a musician knows when a note is missing from a melody. There was another performance coming, and this time, I was the final instrument. The body was taken away, the water washing from the dock in sluggish, curling waves, leaving behind only the echoes of the voices still murmuring in quiet horror. The tourists had been shooed away, the curious onlookers forced back by the gentle but firm hands of the Venetian police. But the city never truly sleeps, and I could feel the weight of unseen eyes behind shuttered windows and half-closed doors, peering through lace curtains, watching, always watching. There was a heaviness in the air, thick with the scent of damp stone and something darker, something that clung to the back of my throat like the taste of rust. I stood there longer than I should have, my fingers curled into fists at my sides, staring at the spot where Alessandra's body had been, as if by looking long enough I could make sense of it. But there was no sense to be found, not in the deliberate cruelty of it, not in the meticulous way her throat had been cut, not in the music carved into her flesh. And yet it was all familiar, too familiar. The past had come back, whispering in the lapping of the canal, singing in the hush of the city before dawn. I turned sharply on my heel and walked away, the heels of my shoes clicking against the stone in time, with the erratic rhythm of my thoughts. There was only one place to go, only one place that could hold the answers. The Academy. It hadn't changed. The Conservatorio della Voce Celestiale stood as it always had, a building of cold, pale stone, its facade grand yet unwelcoming, its windows darkened like the empty sockets of a skull. The iron gates loomed ahead of me, locked for the night, but the Academy was never truly closed. Music never slept. The ghost of a melody floated through the air, just at the edge of hearing, a distant aria sung by a voice I didn't recognize, though I knew it should have been one of the students. I pushed through the smaller side entrance, a door I knew would be open. It always had been, for those who belonged. The moment I stepped inside, the air changed. It was heavier here, laced with the scent of old wood and sheet music, with the faintest trace of sweat and desperation clinging to the walls like an invisible stain. The corridor stretched long before me, lined with framed photographs of past prodigies, their youthful faces frozen in time, their eyes bright with promise or shadowed with something else. I walked past them without looking too closely, afraid of the memories they might awaken. The main practice hall was empty, the grand piano standing like a monolith in the dim glow of the overhead lights. But the silence was deceptive. There was something here, something just out of reach, a whisper of movement, a breath caught in the throat of the building itself. I stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath my weight, the sound swallowed immediately by the vastness of the room. And then I saw it. On the piano, neatly arranged, was a single sheet of music. I knew the melody before I even touched the paper. The notes were inked in a precise, elegant hand, the same hand that had carved them into Alessandra's skin. The same music, the same terrible, inescapable composition. My breath hitched, a sharp inhale of realization. This wasn't just a message. This was an invitation. I turned sharply, scanning the shadows for movement, for the presence I knew had to be here, watching, waiting. But there was nothing. Only the emptiness of the hall, the quiet hum of something unseen pressing against my skin. I was not alone. I could feel it, the way one senses a shift in the air, a change in the temperature, a presence just beyond the edge of sight. I forced myself to stay still, to listen, to wait. And then, just as I had convinced myself that I was imagining things, that the weight of the past was playing tricks on me, I heard it, a single note, high and clear, drifting through the corridor like a ghost. I turned toward the sound, my pulse hammering in my throat. The voice was familiar, too familiar, and it was coming from somewhere deeper in the Academy, from the place where the maestro's favorite voices had once been taken, where their talents had been honed, shaped, broken. The basement. My feet carried me forward before my mind could stop them, my breath coming in shallow, measured exhales as I pushed open the heavy door at the end of the corridor. The stairwell yawned before me, steep and narrow, the kind that always felt as though it had been built to swallow those who dared descend. The walls closed in as I moved downward, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and something else, something metallic and wrong. And then I reached the bottom. The door to the old practice room stood ajar, a sliver of darkness bleeding into the dim light. I hesitated, listening. The voice had stopped. The silence was suffocating, pressing against my ribs, making it difficult to breathe. I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was empty, except for the chair. It stood in the center, a simple wooden thing, worn smooth by years of use. But the straps were new. Thick leather bindings fastened to the arms and legs, the kind designed to hold someone in place. And on the floor beside it, a violin string. Thin, sharp, stained dark. A chill ran through me, sinking deep into my bones. This wasn't just a place of practice. This was something else, something worse. And I had walked straight into it. The room was silent, but the silence itself felt alive, stretching and tightening around me like the strings of a violin drawn too taut, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. My pulse hammered in my ears, a frantic, uneven rhythm that did not belong in a place built for perfect music. The single chair in the center of the room stood like an accusation, its presence impossibly loud in the dim light filtering through the cracked overhead fixture. The leather straps, new and unyielding, lay limp but waiting, as if expecting a body to fill their emptiness. And the violin string on the floor, thin as a whisper, gleamed wetly in the faint glow. I knew what that stain was. I didn't need to touch it to understand. The air was wrong down here, thick with something more than just dust and age, something I recognized but didn't want to name. A presence lingered in the walls, woven into the foundation of this place like an unresolved chord. I could feel it pressing against my skin, the same way I had felt it when I was a boy, standing in this very basement, listening to the maestro's voice echo off the stone, telling us that music was not just an art, but a discipline, that the human voice was an instrument to be perfected at any cost. I had not been good enough to stay. Others had. Alessandra had. And now she was dead. I took a slow step forward, my breath shallow, my senses alert to the darkness pooling in the corners of the room. There were no windows here, no way for sound to escape, no way for anyone above to hear what happened in these walls unless they were meant to. The academy had always been a world of its own, existing apart from the city above, a place where talent was shaped with the ruthless precision of a scalpel. And yet, even with all its grandeur, the truth had always been buried down here, beneath the marble floors and gilded concert halls. The sound of my own footsteps felt intrusive, too loud against the silence. But I moved anyway, drawn toward the chair, toward the unseen weight pressing down on this room. My fingers brushed the back of it lightly, as if expecting the wood to flinch beneath my touch. The straps were stiff but supple, strong enough to hold someone in place. There was no dust on them. They had been used recently. I exhaled slowly, forcing my breathing into something steadier. Someone had been down here, not just recently, very recently. And if this was where they had been keeping their victims, if this was where the notes had been carved into skin, where voices had been stolen, then I was not just standing in a crime scene. I was standing in a performance space, and the conductor was still here. The realization struck me in a slow, creeping wave, washing over me with the kind of certainty that turned the air to ice. I was being watched, not by a presence in memory, not by the ghosts of those who had come before, by something living, something breathing. I felt it before I heard it, the sensation of being studied, measured, as if I were the next note in a song yet to be composed. Then from somewhere behind me, a sound. Not footsteps, not breathing. The softest, most deliberate scrape of a bow against a string. My body locked in place, every muscle coiling into tense awareness. The sound was impossibly slow, a single note drawn out with meticulous care, stretching through the air like a whisper meant only for me. It was coming from deeper in the basement, from the hallway leading to the older practice rooms, the ones that had been abandoned long before my time. I turned my head just slightly, enough to see the doorway in my periphery. The light in the hall flickered once, dimming, casting the space into deeper shadow. Another note. Higher this time. It was not a performance. It was a message. I had been invited into the music, and now the conductor was waiting for me to follow. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to turn back, to get out while I still could. But another part of me, the part that had spent years bearing the past only to have it resurface with a body in the canal, knew that there was no turning back. Not now. not when I was this close. Slowly, carefully, I stepped away from the chair and toward the hallway, my heartbeat a steady pounding in my chest. The walls here were narrower, the darkness more complete, the smell of damp stone heavier in the air. The academy had always been elegant in its decay, but down here, beneath the polished surface, it was something else entirely. The corridors twisted in ways that did not make sense, leading to rooms that had not been used in decades, places that should have been forgotten. But someone remembered. The notes continued, soft and deliberate, leading me deeper, guiding me like a trail of breadcrumbs through the dark. And then, just as I reached the end of the hall, the music stopped. Silence, I froze. My breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a whisper. A single light flickered ahead, illuminating the old practice room at the very end of the corridor. The door was open just a fraction, revealing the edge of a music stand, a violin resting in its holder. The strings still quivered slightly as if recently played. And then I saw it, the mirror. It stood against the far wall, reflecting the dim light, casting the room in distorted angles. But the image staring back at me was wrong, because I was standing alone in the doorway. But in the reflection, there was someone behind me, watching, waiting. For a moment, I could not move. My breath was a sharp, jagged thing caught in my throat, the edges of my vision narrowing as my mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. The mirror's surface was slightly warped, its antique glass rippling faintly in the dim light. But there was no mistaking the shape standing just behind me. A figure, tall and unmoving, their presence solid despite the impossibility of it. My own reflection stood rigid in the doorway, my face pale, my hands clenched at my sides. But the shadow behind me was different, still, patient, as if it had been waiting for me to turn around. I forced myself to breathe, to steady the trembling that had crept into my fingers. The air in the room was thick with a quiet hum, something that was not quite sound but not quite silence either. A vibration that settled into my bones like an unplayed note waiting to be struck. Slowly, carefully, I shifted my weight, my muscles coiled tight, my every instinct screaming at me to move, to run, to do anything but remain frozen in the threshold of that dimly lit room. And then the figure moved, not a step, not a shift of weight, just the slightest tilt of the head, a motion so deliberate, so measured, that it sent ice down my spine. It was not a mistake, not a trick of the light. Someone was there, and they wanted me to see them. I turned sharply, my breath rushing out in a single, sharp exhale. My body braced for whatever waited behind me. But the hallway was empty. The dim glow from the overhead fixture flickered once, casting the narrow corridor into deeper shadow, and the silence that followed was heavier than before. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears, my mind scrambling to reconcile what I had seen with the undeniable emptiness around me. My skin prickled with something colder than fear, something deeper, something that felt like recognition. I knew this presence, not in the way one knows a person, with names and faces and memories, but in the way one knows a melody from childhood, a song half remembered but never truly forgotten. It was in the air, in the walls, in the very foundation of this place, lingering like the echo of a voice that had never stopped singing. I turned back toward the mirror, my own reflection staring back at me, pale and drawn, my shoulders tense with something that had not quite faded. The room beyond the glass was exactly as it should be, the music stand still in place, the violin resting silently, the dim light casting everything in muted gold. No shadow, no figure, but I knew what I had seen, and I knew I was not alone. I stepped into the room, the floor beneath me groaning slightly under my weight, the faint scent of rosin and aged wood thick in the air. The violin on the stand was old but well cared for, its strings taut, its bow resting neatly beside it. Someone had been playing. Recently. My eyes moved to the mirror again, my pulse still uneven, my skin crawling with the awareness of something unseen. The reflection of the room was identical, perfectly symmetrical, perfectly ordinary. But there was something about it, something that felt off in a way I could not immediately name. The edges of the glass shimmered faintly, like the surface of disturbed water, distorting ever so slightly as if the reflection itself was shifting beneath its surface. I moved closer. The moment my fingers brushed against the frame, the violin's strings vibrated, a single clear note ringing out in the stillness. I jerked my hand away from the mirror, my breath catching, my pulse slamming against my ribs. The note hung in the air for a fraction too long, its resonance unnatural, lingering as though unwilling to fade. The violin had not been touched. There was no bow to set the strings into motion, and yet the sound had been real. My hands clenched at my sides, the sharp sting of my own nails digging into my palms, grounding me in the moment. Something was happening here, something deliberate, something calculated. This was not just a crime scene. This was a stage, and someone was watching. I forced myself to move, to turn away from the mirror, to push down the growing unease clawing at the edges of my mind. My gaze landed on the desk near the far wall, a stack of sheet music scattered across its surface, some of the pages curling at the edges with age. I stepped toward it, my fingers tracing the worn paper, my eyes scanning the notes inked onto the fragile sheets. It was the same composition, the same impossible, intricate melody that had been carved into Alessandra's skin. But this version was incomplete. There were gaps in the arrangement, spaces where notes should have been, where something had been left unfinished. My breath came slower now, more controlled, my thoughts sharp despite the weight of the air pressing down on me. This was not just the work of a killer. This was something else, a message, a puzzle, a performance waiting for its final note. I reached for the top page, turning it over carefully, and there, scrawled in the same precise hand that had inked the notes, was a single line of text. The silent instrument must finally play. The words sent a slow, crawling dread through my veins, a realization settling in my chest with the weight of inevitability. This was never about Alessandra, or the others, not entirely. This was about me, the last unplayed note, the final piece of the composition, and the maestro, whoever had taken up his legacy, whoever had turned this twisted performance into something more than revenge, was waiting for me to take my place in the choir of the drowned. The words on the page did not shift or blur, but they may as well have, because my vision pulsed as if my mind refused to process what I was seeing. The silent instrument must finally play. It was not a threat, not a plea, but a command, a statement of fact. My throat felt tight, as though unseen fingers had curled around it, pressing down, testing for sound that would not come. My voice had failed me once, all those years ago, and now it seemed that failure had not just spared me, it had condemned me. The realization did not come suddenly, but in pieces, like the slow unraveling of a frayed thread. This was never random. It was not simply the work of a killer striking out at old classmates, at survivors of the Academy's brutal teachings. It was something else, a composition, a creation. Each murder had been a note in a song that had not yet reached its climax, each victim a musician who had once played their part in the maestro's grand design. And I had been spared, not because I was unworthy, but because I had been held in reserve. The missing instrument, the unplayed chord, and now the final performance was waiting. The air in the practice room pressed in around me, thick with silence, heavy with the kind of anticipation that only comes before the first strike of a bow, before the first breath of a singer waiting to fill an opera house with sound. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering against my ribs, and turned sharply away from the desk, the unfinished sheet music still clutched between my fingers. I needed to move, to leave, to step back from the edge of whatever this was before I was pulled under. But the moment I turned, I knew I was no longer alone. The door to the hallway stood open, just a fraction wider than before. The space beyond it darker than it should have been, as though the very light had been swallowed by something unseen. And there, standing just beyond the threshold, was a figure, tall, still, waiting. My breath caught in my throat, my body locking in place even as every instinct screamed for me to run. The figure did not move, did not speak, but I could feel the weight of their presence pressing against my skin, settling into the spaces between my ribs. The air was wrong around them, thick and silent, like the moment before a conductor raises his hands and brings the orchestra to life. And then, without sound, without any visible movement, they stepped forward. The light caught their face just enough for me to see the mask. It was porcelain, smooth and pale, molded into the perfect, expressionless features of a classical Venetian performer. The eyes were hollowed out, empty sockets that should have revealed the face beneath, but there was only darkness, an absence that made my stomach twist with something deeper than fear. The masked lips were painted the faintest shade of red, as if stained with a whisper of something unspeakable, and around their neck, barely visible beneath the collar of their dark coat, was a single, thin scar. The air in my lungs turned to ice. I knew that scar. I had seen it before, had seen it on Alessandra, had seen it on the body pulled from the canal. It was the mark of a voice stolen, of vocal cords severed with surgical precision. But this person was alive, and that meant something worse. They had not been silenced. They had chosen silence. I took an unsteady step back, my fingers tightening around the sheet music as if it could somehow shield me from the thing standing in the doorway. The figure did not follow. They only watched, waited. And then, very slowly, they lifted one hand, their fingers curling in a motion that was unmistakable. An invitation, a demand. I shook my head once, barely more than a breath of movement, but the figure did not react. Instead, they reached into their coat, withdrawing something small, something that caught the dim light with a glint of steel. A tuning fork. They raised it slightly, tilting their head, and then struck it lightly against the doorframe. The note it produced was perfect, resonant, vibrating through the air like the lingering echo of something inevitable. The sound shuddered through my bones, sinking deep into my ribs, setting my teeth on edge. It was not just a note, it was a signal, a beginning, and somewhere deep within the academy, from the very foundation of the building itself, another sound answered. Music, not from an instrument, not from a recording, a voice, soft at first, rising from the depths like something pulled from water, filling the silence with something wordless and cold. I knew that voice. Alessandra. My breath came fast and shallow, the weight of the sound pressing against me, each note precise, controlled, as though the very walls of the academy had memorized her final aria and were now singing it back. It was impossible. It was wrong. And yet it was happening. The figure in the mask did not move, but I could feel their presence thickening, merging with the music, with the weight of the past pressing in from all sides. The tuning fork's note had faded, but its effect had not. The composition had resumed, and I was standing at its center. The air tightened around me, and I knew, with a clarity that sent a slow, crawling dread through my veins, that I had a choice. I could turn and run, leave the academy, leave Venice, leave the ghosts of the past behind. But the music would not stop. It would follow. It had always followed. Or I could step forward into the darkness, into the waiting silence, and take my place in the final movement of the maestro's twisted composition. The silent instrument must finally play. And somewhere beneath the hum of the academy's old stone, the water stirred. You ever hear a town go quiet? Not just the normal silence of a late night or an early morning, but something deeper, something unnatural. The kind of quiet where even the wind holds its breath, where the birds disappear from the trees, where the world seems to pause as if waiting for something terrible to happen. That was what Black Hollow felt like in the fall of 2015, when the first bones were found. It started with a boy named Luke Foster, 17 years old, a decent kid by all accounts, though no one in Black Hollow is ever as perfect as they seem. He had a habit of sneaking out at night, nothing unusual for a teenager with too much energy and too little sense. His mother thought he was just out drinking with friends, maybe chasing after some girl. But when the sun came up and his bed was still empty, the worry started creeping in. By nightfall, that worry had turned into fear. And by the time the search parties were combing the woods, that fear had hardened into something cold and awful. The Foster family's land stretched deep into the trees, a sprawling property that had once belonged to the logging company before the town dried up and the jobs left. It wasn't the kind of place you got lost in by accident, but it was exactly the kind of place you could disappear if someone wanted you gone. I was there the night they found him, or what was left of him. The call came in just after 11. I remember because I had been staring at the clock, watching the seconds tick by in my office, drowning in paperwork that never seemed to end. The dispatcher's voice was tight, clipped in a way that told me this wasn't just another drunk passed out in a ditch or some hunter trespassing where he shouldn't. When I pulled up to the old logging road, the red and blue lights of the patrol cars threw strange shadows against the trees, making everything look sharper, more jagged. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic that settled in the back of my throat, like the aftertaste of a bad dream. The deputy who found him was standing a few feet back, his flashlight pointed at the ground, his face pale in the artificial glow. "You're going to want to see this, Sheriff," he said, his voice just above a whisper. I followed his beam of light, my boots sinking slightly into the soft ground as I moved closer. And then I saw it. Bones. Not scattered, not chewed up by animals or buried beneath the underbrush. Arranged. Luke Foster's skeleton had been laid out with careful precision, each bone placed deliberately, almost reverently, on a bed of dead leaves. His skull rested at the top, empty eye sockets staring up at the night sky, and his fingers were curled slightly, as if reaching for something just beyond his grasp. But something was wrong. Something was missing. I crouched beside the remains, scanning the pattern, the arrangement, my brain cataloging each piece the way I had been trained to do in the academy all those years ago. And then it hit me, his left femur. Gone. "Where's the rest of him?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "This is it," the deputy said, shifting uncomfortably beside me. "No blood, no tracks, no sign of an animal. Just this." I looked at the trees, at the endless stretch of darkness beyond the reach of our flashlights. The forest felt different now, as if it were watching us instead of the other way around. Something moved in the distance, a rustling of leaves, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Luke Foster was the first, but he wouldn't be the last. The morning after we found Luke Foster's remains, Black Hollow felt different. People walked a little faster, spoke a little quieter, as if their voices might stir something lurking just beneath the surface of the town. Parents kept their kids inside, locking their doors even in broad daylight, because once a town like this loses its sense of safety, it never quite comes back. Everyone was waiting for an answer, but I didn't have one. I sat in my office staring at the report in front of me, but the words blurred together. Cause of death, unknown. Estimated time of death, unknown. The forensic team had done their best, but there were too many questions. No blood at the scene, no sign of a struggle, no clear indication of how Luke had died before he was reduced to nothing but carefully arranged bones in the dirt. The missing femur nagged at me. It wasn't just gone, it had been taken, deliberately removed, leaving the rest of him perfectly intact. That kind of precision wasn't the work of an animal. And then 3 days later, we found another one. The call came in at dawn, before the sun had fully risen, before the town had shaken off the uneasy sleep of a community waiting for bad news. I knew before I even picked up the radio that it would be another body. There was something about the silence on the other end, about the way the dispatcher hesitated before saying my name. Sheriff Dalton, another one. This time the bones were found on the edge of town, near the old railway tracks that hadn't seen a train in decades. The weeds grew tall there, curling over the rusted metal like fingers, the ground thick with layers of dead leaves and forgotten history. When I arrived, the deputy on scene looked worse than the last time. Younger kid, fresh out of the academy, still adjusting to the idea that Black Hollow had anything more dangerous than bar fights and petty theft. "Same as before," he said, his voice tight, "laid out like the last one, and..." He hesitated. "Something's missing again." I didn't ask what. I already knew. The remains were nearly identical to Luke Foster's, clean, stripped bare, arranged with an unsettling kind of care, as if whoever had done this wasn't just disposing of a body but creating something. a display, a message. And just like before, a single bone was missing. The victim was Sarah Whitmore, 17, a high school senior, straight A student, volunteered at the library on weekends. I remembered her because I had seen her just last week, walking home from school with a book tucked under her arm, smiling at something her friend had said. That smile was gone now, reduced to nothing but the hollow sockets of her skull staring up at the sky. I crouched beside the remains, my fingers tightening into fists as I scanned the pattern, the unnatural precision of it. The grass beneath her was undisturbed, no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading in or out. It was as if she had simply appeared here, already reduced to bones, already arranged. And then, just like with Luke, the realization crept over me like a slow-moving shadow. Her right humerus, gone. 2 victims, 2 missing bones. I looked up at the trees at the tangled stretch of wilderness beyond the tracks, and for the first time in my career, I felt something cold settle into my chest. This wasn't just a killer. This was a collector. By the time we buried what was left of Sarah Whitmore, Black Hollow was unraveling. The town had always been quiet, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and kids rode their bikes past sundown without a second thought. But after the second set of bones was found, that silence took on a different weight, thick and unnatural, like the town itself was holding its breath. Parents kept their kids home from school. Teenagers who once spent their nights sneaking off to the woods now stayed inside, their bedroom windows locked tight. People started looking over their shoulders, whispering to each other in grocery store aisles, in church pews, at the diner counter where the coffee had gone stale from sitting too long. No one wanted to say it out loud, but they were all thinking the same thing. This wasn't over. I sat at my desk, staring at the case files spread out in front of me, the faces of Luke Foster and Sarah Whitmore looking up from their yearbook photos. 2 kids, both 17, both taken at night, their bones stripped clean and laid out like a grotesque exhibit. 2 missing bones, 1 from each body, the femur from Luke, the humerus from Sarah. Not random, not a coincidence. Someone was taking them for a reason. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling slowly as I tried to fit the pieces together. The problem was, there were too many gaps, too many unknowns. The forensic team had confirmed that the bones had been cleaned with surgical precision, no teeth marks, no signs of trauma, no indication of how they had been stripped down so perfectly. It wasn't the work of scavengers, it wasn't the weather, it was human hands. Careful, practiced hands. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts, and I looked up to see Dr. Elliot Warren standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He was one of the few doctors left in Black Hollow, a former orthopedic surgeon who had retired early after losing his wife to cancer. He had always kept to himself, lived alone in the old house at the edge of town, the kind of man people respected but never really knew. He had volunteered to consult on the case, and I had agreed, partly because he was the most qualified person we had, but also because I wanted to see if any of this disturbed him the way it was disturbing me. "I finished my analysis," he said, stepping inside and placing a folder on my desk. His voice was even, calm, but there was something in his eyes, something unsettled. I opened the file, scanning the pages of detailed notes and photographs. "The bones were cut cleanly," he continued, "but there's something else. The missing bones. They weren't just removed. They were taken carefully with intent." I looked up at him. "You think they were being used for something?" His hesitation told me everything. "Maybe," he admitted. "I've never seen anything like it. The cuts are precise, the way a surgeon might do it, but there's no medical reason for this. It's not just about the bones themselves. It's about what they represent." "What do you mean?" Dr. Warren sighed, rubbing his temple before meeting my gaze. "Bones are the foundation of the body. You remove a femur, a humerus. You're taking away function, stability, the ability to stand, the ability to reach. If this person is choosing specific bones, they might be trying to create something or fix something." His words sent a slow chill through me, settling deep in my gut. A collector, a surgeon, a purpose. I closed the folder and stood, the chair scraping against the worn floorboards as I moved toward the window. Outside, Black Hollow stretched in uneasy stillness. the trees at the edge of town swaying in the wind, the forest watching with its dark, endless eyes. I knew with a certainty that made my skin crawl that this wasn't just about Luke or Sarah. There would be another one, and I wasn't sure we would find them in time. The town had started to feel smaller, like the walls were closing in, the streets narrowing, the spaces between houses tightening, as if Black Hollow itself was trying to hold its breath. The air carried a strange weight now, a quiet unease that settled in the bones of the people who lived here. We were all waiting for the next body, the next set of bones, the next missing piece in a puzzle that none of us could quite see. I had barely slept the night before. I had sat at my desk long after the station had emptied, staring at the photographs of Luke Foster and Sarah Whitmore, their skeletons stripped bare, their missing bones like gaps in an unfinished story. Dr. Warren's words had echoed in my head, his careful, measured voice repeating over and over again. If this person is choosing specific bones, they might be trying to create something or fix something. I had gone through every medical report, every missing persons file, every cold case in Black Hollow's history, looking for a pattern, for a connection, and I had found nothing until the third body was found, or rather the third victim, because this time, for the first time, the person wasn't dead. The call came just after midnight, a voice crackling through the radio, breathless, urgent. A hunter had found someone in the woods, barely alive, curled against the roots of an old oak tree like a discarded doll. I had been out the door before the dispatcher had even finished speaking, the tires of my truck kicking up gravel as I sped down the old logging road toward the western edge of the forest. The moon was high, casting long shadows between the trees, making everything feel stretched, distorted. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something sickly sweet that I couldn't quite place. By the time I reached the clearing, my deputies were already there, their flashlights cutting sharp beams of white through the darkness. And in the center of it all, lying on the ground, was a boy. He couldn't have been older than 16, his skin pale as wax, his lips cracked, his breath shallow and uneven. His clothes were torn, his body covered in dirt and scratches. But he was alive, barely. His eyes fluttered open as I knelt beside him, and for the briefest moment, he looked at me. Not with relief, not with fear, but with something else, something hollow and distant, like he was staring through me instead of at me. His mouth moved, lips trembling, and I leaned in closer, my heart pounding, waiting for him to say something, anything. But when the words finally came, they weren't what I expected. "Help me," he whispered. "Please, don't let him take any more." A cold wave of dread rolled through me, and I felt my fingers tighten against the damp earth. "Who?" I asked, my voice steady despite the unease curling in my gut. "Who did this to you?" But his eyelids fluttered, his body going limp against the ground, and before he could answer, he was unconscious. The paramedics arrived minutes later, lifting him onto a stretcher, their faces tight with urgency. I stepped back, watching as they carried him toward the ambulance. But my mind was already working, already trying to piece together what this meant. This was different. This wasn't a body arranged in the dirt, wasn't another skeleton stripped bare. This was someone who had survived, and that meant the killer wasn't finished. One of the deputies came up beside me, his voice low. "Sheriff, there's something else. You should see this." I turned, following him toward the base of the tree where the boy had been found. The ground was uneven, the dirt disturbed, and at first I didn't see it. But then my eyes adjusted, and I realized what I was looking at. A femur, a humerus, the missing bones, placed carefully in the roots of the tree side by side like an offering. My pulse pounded in my ears. The pattern had changed. The pieces were coming back together, and that meant the collector was almost done. The boy's words haunted me as I drove back into town, the road stretching endlessly before me, the dark silhouettes of trees pressing in from both sides. "Please, don't let him take any more." He had seen the killer, or at least knew what was happening, but his body had given out before he could tell me the truth. The hospital had taken him in, and I knew I would get another chance to speak with him, but I also knew that time was running out. The missing bones had been returned, carefully placed in the roots of that old oak tree, like pieces of a puzzle that had finally found their way home. That meant the collector was almost finished, and if he was nearly done, then there was one more piece left to take. I had spent weeks trying to understand what the missing bones meant, why Luke Foster's femur and Sarah Whitmore's humerus had been chosen. Dr. Warren had told me it was about structure, about stability, but I hadn't seen the full picture until now. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as realization settled in my gut, cold and heavy. The femur supported the body's weight, the humerus controlled reach, but there was one more function, one more fundamental piece that had yet to be taken: the spine. A sick feeling curled in my stomach. Whoever the collector was, they weren't just taking random bones. They were reconstructing something. No, not something. Someone. I pulled into the hospital parking lot just as my radio crackled to life, my deputy's voice sharp with urgency. "Sheriff, you need to get to Dr. Warren's house now." My stomach clenched. "What's going on?" A pause, then a breath. The kid woke up. He said the man who took him was a doctor. The phone slipped from my fingers, landing in the passenger seat with a dull thud. But I was already moving, already throwing the truck into reverse and peeling out of the parking lot. The road blurred past me, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I had suspected Dr. Warren before, but I had pushed it aside, convinced that his involvement had only been that of a concerned medical professional. But I had been wrong. I reached his house in minutes, my tires skidding against the gravel as I jumped out, my gun already drawn. The house stood silent, the windows dark, the air around it still in a way that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I moved quickly, my boots crunching against the dry leaves as I approached the door. It was unlocked. I pushed it open slowly, my breath steady, my heartbeat anything but. The inside of the house smelled of antiseptic and something older, something bitter and decayed. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with medical texts, anatomy diagrams, and framed diplomas that all bore the same name: Dr. Elliot Warren. And then I saw the basement door. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond it, a whisper of something waiting in the silence. I moved toward it, every instinct screaming at me to be ready. The wooden stairs creaked beneath my weight as I descended, the air growing colder, the smell thickening. And then I saw it. A table in the center of the room, metal and sterile, the kind you'd see in an operating room. Beside it, a tray of surgical tools, each one polished, laid out with the same precise care that had been used to arrange the bones in the woods. And on the far wall, illuminated by the dim flickering light, was a display. Bones, not scattered, not forgotten, arranged. A human skeleton pieced together from different bodies, its missing spine replaced with a metal rod. The femur and humerus, once missing, now placed perfectly where they belonged. A body reconstructed, unfinished but nearly complete. And then I heard the breath behind me. I turned fast, gun raised, and there he stood. Dr. Warren, his face was calm, his eyes steady, as if this moment had always been inevitable. He looked at me the way a teacher looks at a slow-learning student, with patience and quiet disappointment. "You don't understand," he said softly, as if we were discussing something simple, something logical. It wasn't murder, it was restoration. I tightened my grip on the gun. "You killed those kids." His lips pressed into a thin line. "I saved them, or at least, I tried. You see, Sheriff, my wife was dying long before the cancer took her. She had a rare condition. Her bones were failing, breaking beneath her like brittle twigs. I spent years trying to find a cure, but there wasn't one. Not then. Not in time." His eyes flickered to the skeleton on the wall. "But I knew I could fix it, given enough time, given the right pieces." I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. "This isn't fixing anything. It's butchery." Dr. Warren sighed, shaking his head. "You're thinking like a lawman, not a surgeon. Bones can be replaced. The human body is just a machine, a perfect structure that can be rebuilt, repaired. I was refining my methods, perfecting the process, and I was so close." I glanced at the table, at the restraints fastened to its sides. It was empty now, but I knew it hadn't always been. "And the kid?" The one who survived? His expression darkened slightly. An accident. He wasn't strong enough. The others, they were chosen carefully. They were healthy, their bones perfect. He wasn't. That's why I had to return the pieces. He gestured toward the skeleton. I only need one more. My stomach twisted. A spine. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, there was something almost pleading in them. The most vital structure of all. The thing that allows a body to stand, to move, to hold itself together. And once I have it, she will be complete. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The basement hummed with the quiet buzz of the overhead light, the scent of antiseptic and old decay filling the silence between us. Then he took a step forward. I pulled the trigger. The sound shattered the quiet, echoed off the walls, and Dr. Warren staggered back, a dark bloom spreading across his chest. He looked down at it, almost thoughtful, before his legs gave out and he crumpled to the ground. He gasped once, his fingers twitching slightly, then went still. I stood there for a long moment, my breath heavy, my heart still hammering against my ribs. The skeleton on the wall remained untouched, its empty sockets staring out at nothing, the unfinished body waiting for something that would never come. By the time the deputies arrived, I was still staring at it. The collector was dead, but the bones remained, and something about that, something about the way they stood there waiting, made me wonder if maybe, just maybe, Dr. Warren had never really been working alone. They say the dead have stories to tell, and I've spent my life giving them voices. My hands work clay, bone, and memory, sculpting the nameless back into existence. Each skull that crosses my table whispers a past, a life lost to time or violence. Some come from cold cases, their bones unearthed in forgotten places, waiting for me to shape their identities, while others arrive fresh from the morgue, their flesh too far gone for recognition. I work in silence, save for the soft rasp of my tools against bone, the low hum of the lamp overhead, and the occasional creak of my office chair. My name is Adrian Moreau, and I restore the lost. It was late when the package arrived, a dull knock at my door, an unexpected sound that cut through the quiet of my apartment like a blade. I hesitated, my mind flickering between ignoring it and answering. But something, curiosity, instinct, maybe even fate, drew me to my feet. The hallway was empty when I opened the door. The only evidence of a visitor was the box sitting just outside the threshold. Plain brown cardboard, no return address, only my name scrawled across the top in looping, deliberate handwriting. I carried it inside, setting it on the table under the sterile white light of my desk lamp. My fingers hesitated on the edges of the flaps, an unease curling in my stomach. There was something about it, something wrong, though I couldn't yet say why. I opened it. The smell hit me first, not the overwhelming stench of rot, but something more insidious, formaldehyde and something else, something sickly sweet. My breath caught as I pushed aside the protective padding, and then I saw it, a head perfectly preserved, resting in the box as if it had been placed there with care. The skin pale but unmarred, the lips slightly parted in what almost looked like a smile, the eyes mercifully closed, the hair dark, neatly combed, the expression serene. I stumbled back, my breath ragged, heart hammering against my ribs. For a moment I thought this was a mistake, a sick joke, but then I saw the envelope nestled beside the head, my name written again on its surface. My hands shook as I opened it. Restore him. 2 words, no signature, no explanation, just an instruction. I looked back at the face in the box, and something cold settled in my chest. Someone had gone through great lengths to preserve this man, to send him to me like a puzzle waiting to be solved. But this was no forgotten skull from the archives, no anonymous relic of an unsolved crime. This was fresh. I reached out, hesitant, my fingers barely grazing the preserved skin. It was cold, unnervingly smooth, the texture too perfect, too artificial in its preservation. I had seen death in all its forms, bloated, skeletal, disfigured, but this was something different, It was as if the man was waiting. I stood there for what felt like hours, the weight of the room pressing in, the sound of my own breath too loud in my ears. The box sat open on my table, the head staring sightlessly at the ceiling. My instinct screamed to call the police to let them handle this. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, an obligation, a dark compulsion. I was an artist of the dead, and someone somewhere had chosen me for this. The question was why? I didn't sleep that night. The head remained where I had left it, still and silent, the corners of its lips frozen in that unnatural hint of a smile. My apartment, usually a sanctuary of quiet focus, felt different now, as if something unseen had crept in with the arrival of that box. Every shadow stretched too far, every creak of the wooden floor beneath my feet felt like a whisper of warning. I paced the room, the weight of the note still heavy in my hands. The words burned into my mind, restore him. At some point, exhaustion overtook fear, and I found myself seated at my work table, the harsh white light of the lamp illuminating the preserved features before me. My hands hovered just above the head, hesitant, unwilling to make the first touch. But then, as if compelled by something beyond my own reasoning, I reached out and turned it gently in my grasp, examining the preservation technique with the same meticulous eye I used in my forensic reconstructions. Whoever had done this was no amateur. The embalming was precise, the skin treated in a way that made it appear almost lifelike, as if he were merely resting rather than long departed. I traced the contours of his features, noting the symmetry of his face, the smoothness of his brow, the way his lips curved ever so slightly, as if he had died with a secret still lingering on his tongue. It was too perfect, too intentional, and that realization sent a fresh wave of unease crawling up my spine. Death was never this kind. I had seen men and women reduced to brittle bones and forgotten identities, their final expressions twisted in agony or frozen in the blank emptiness of oblivion. But this was something else entirely. The air in the room felt heavier the longer I studied him. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Midnight had come and gone, but I hadn't moved, my fingers tracing the features of the stranger before me as if searching for some hidden answer beneath the surface. I needed to know who he was, why he had been sent to me, why someone believed I was the one who could bring him back in some way. I forced myself to stand, my chair scraping against the floor with a sharp screech that sent a shiver through me. My laptop sat open at the edge of my desk, waiting, the glow of the screen casting an eerie light across the room. I hesitated before typing, unsure what I was even searching for. Unsolved cases, missing persons reports, anything that might match the man in front of me? My fingers moved on their own, scanning through news articles, police reports, anything that might give me even the faintest clue. But there was nothing. No missing person matching his features, no reports of an unidentified body turning up under suspicious circumstances. The only thing that existed was the head itself, delivered to my doorstep like some twisted invitation. I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair, the exhaustion settling deep into my bones. I needed to step back, to think, to do something other than stare at the preserved face in front of me. I stood and crossed the room, moving to the window, my gaze drifting to the street below. Paris was never truly silent, even in the dead of night. The glow of streetlights shimmered on the wet pavement, and in the distance I could hear the low hum of passing cars, the occasional sound of footsteps echoing through the alleyways. Life continued as if nothing was wrong, as if there wasn't something unnatural sitting in my apartment, waiting for me to make sense of it. And then I saw it. A figure barely visible, standing just at the edge of the lamplight across the street, dressed in dark clothing, motionless, watching. My breath hitched, my pulse quickened, and for a moment I convinced myself that I was imagining things, that my sleep-deprived mind was conjuring ghosts where there were none. But then, ever so slowly, the figure moved. Not towards me, not away, but just enough for me to know that they saw me too. I stepped back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest, my hands trembling at my sides. The rational part of my mind told me it was coincidence, that it was just another sleepless wanderer in the city, nothing more. But the part of me that had spent years reconstructing the faces of the forgotten, that had seen the cruel precision of death, knew better. Someone had sent me that head, and now someone was watching to see what I would do with it. Morning came too slowly, dragging itself across the sky like a heavy burden, and with it came an exhaustion so deep that my body felt weighed down, as if I had aged overnight. The figure on the street had disappeared before dawn, vanishing into the shadows of Paris like a specter that had never truly been there at all. And yet, even as sunlight crept through the thin curtains of my apartment, that oppressive feeling of being watched did not fade. The head still sat on my work table, untouched since the night before, its pale skin illuminated by the weak morning light filtering through the window. I had spent hours debating whether to call the police, whether to wash my hands of this grotesque gift and let someone else unravel the mystery. But each time I reached for my phone, something held me back. It was a feeling I couldn't quite name, a whisper in the back of my mind telling me that I had been chosen for a reason, that whoever had sent this had done so with purpose. I forced myself to move, to go through the motions of mourning, even though it felt absurd to do so with death sitting so openly in my home. I brewed coffee, the rich scent filling the space, grounding me for a moment in something normal. But as I took my first sip, my gaze drifted back to the table, to the serene expression frozen in time. I had spent years reconstructing faces from nothing more than bone, bringing the long-forgotten back into the world. But this was different. This face was still here, still intact, preserved with unnatural precision. It wasn't just about identification. Someone wanted me to see him like this. I set the coffee down, my fingers gripping the edge of the table, as I forced myself to analyze what was in front of me like I would with any other case. The embalming process was meticulous, far more advanced than any standard mortuary work. The skin had been treated with something beyond the usual preservation chemicals, something that kept it soft and pliable, almost too lifelike. The lips, though slightly parted, revealed no sign of decay, no stiffness, no evidence of the inevitable breakdown that death brings. Whoever had done this had wanted to keep him perfect. But why? I needed to know more. I pulled on gloves, the familiar snap of latex settling something in my mind. A ritual of detachment. I turned the head slightly, examining the hairline, the curve of the jaw, searching for anything that might give me a clue about who he had been in life. His features were striking, symmetrical in a way that suggested a certain genetic fortune, dark lashes resting against pale skin, lips full enough to suggest youth but not so much that they seemed unnatural. He could have been anywhere between 30 and 40, though the preservation made it difficult to tell for certain. I reached for my calipers, measuring the width of his cheekbones, the structure of his nose, cataloging every detail the way I always did. Usually I would be working with nothing but bone, reconstructing from the absence of flesh. But this time, everything was already there. And yet the absence remained. The absence of identity, the absence of history, a face without a name. I opened my laptop again, searching through missing persons reports with renewed determination. I narrowed the parameters: men, Caucasian, estimated age range, last seen within the past 6 months. Pages of faces filled the screen, but none of them matched. No one was looking for him. It was as if he had never existed. Frustration clawed at me, but beneath it, something colder crept in. Whoever had sent him to me had gone through great lengths to ensure that he arrived in this condition. They had preserved him, protected him, and delivered him with a clear instruction: restore him. The question that gnawed at me wasn't just who he was, but who had made him this way. A sharp knock at the door jolted me from my thoughts, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was too sudden, too deliberate. My pulse pounded in my ears as I hesitated, staring at the door as if expecting it to burst open on its own. For a moment I considered ignoring it, letting whoever was on the other side fade back into the unknown. But then the knock came again, firmer this time, insistent. I wiped my hands on my jeans, forcing my movements to remain steady as I crossed the room. The peephole revealed nothing but an unfamiliar man in a dark coat, his face partially obscured by the angle of the fisheye lens. Something about him felt off, not overtly threatening, but not entirely safe either. I hesitated before unlocking the door, my fingers tight around the handle as I pulled it open just enough to see him clearly. Adrian Moreau? His voice was smooth, practiced, as if he had rehearsed this moment. I nodded, my throat too dry to answer immediately. The man offered a thin smile, reaching into his coat and producing a small envelope, holding it out to me with gloved fingers. "A message for you." I didn't take it right away. My eyes flickered down to his hands, noting the precise way he held the envelope, as if careful not to crease it. He wasn't a courier. He wasn't delivering this as part of some ordinary job. "Who sent you?" My voice was steadier than I felt. The man's smile didn't waver, but something in his eyes darkened. They preferred to remain anonymous. I didn't move, didn't take the envelope. The silence stretched between us, thick and unyielding, but he didn't seem uncomfortable. He was waiting, patient, expectant. Finally, I reached out, my fingers brushing against the smooth paper as I took it from him. He gave a slight nod, then turned without another word, disappearing down the hall as quickly as he had come. I shut the door, my hands tightening around the envelope as I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my pulse. There was no name on it, no markings of any kind. Just like the first note. I opened it with careful precision, my breath hitching as I unfolded the small piece of paper inside. The words were written in the same looping, deliberate handwriting. "He is the first, but not the last." I stared at the note, the weight of its meaning settling into my chest like ice. This wasn't over. This was just beginning. I read the note again, as if the words might shift under my gaze, as if some hidden message might reveal itself if I only looked long enough. "He is the first, but not the last." My fingers tightened around the paper, the edges bending beneath the pressure of my grip. The first had arrived in a box, carefully preserved, waiting for me like some grotesque offering. The words on the note made it clear there would be more. I forced myself to breathe, to push past the panic tightening in my chest. My mind raced through possibilities, searching for logic in a situation that had none. Who had chosen me for this, and why? I was a forensic artist, not a detective, not a coroner. My work was meant to give the dead back their faces, to offer closure to families who had spent years searching for answers. But this wasn't about closure. This was something else entirely. The head still sat on my work table, its expression unchanged, as if it too was waiting. I turned away from it, unable to shake the feeling that those closed eyes hid something I wasn't yet meant to see. I needed to act, to take control of whatever this was before it spiraled even further into something I couldn't contain. I grabbed my phone with shaking fingers, scrolling through my contacts until I found the one name that might be able to help. Julian Marchand, homicide detective, old friend, someone who had seen more than his fair share of horrors in the city's underbelly. If anyone would know what to do, it was him. I hesitated for only a second before pressing the call button, lifting the phone to my ear. It rang once, twice. Then his voice came through, rough with sleep. "Moreau, do you know what time it is?" I glanced at the clock on the wall. 6:42 a.m. Too early for most, but not for someone like him. "I need to see you," I said, my voice lower than I intended. "It's important." There was a pause on the other end, a rustling sound, the creak of a mattress shifting. "You sound like hell. What's going on?" I glanced back at the work table, at the preserved face that refused to give up its secrets. "It's not something I can explain over the phone," I said, my throat dry. "Can you meet me?" Another pause, then a sigh. "Give me an hour." I hung up without another word, my pulse still uneven. I needed to get out of the apartment, away from the oppressive stillness that had settled over it since the arrival of the first package. The thought of leaving the head behind even for a short time unsettled me, but the alternative, bringing it with me, was even worse. I would meet Julian. I would tell him everything. I would let him take over and let this nightmare become someone else's problem. At least that's what I told myself. I barely had time to grab my coat before another knock sounded at the door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, my hand hovering inches from the doorknob. The last knock had brought an envelope. A warning. I wasn't ready for another. Slowly, I stepped forward, peering through the peephole, my heart hammering against my ribs. But there was no one there. Only emptiness. Only silence. I exhaled shakily, my fingers tightening around the doorknob. It could have been my neighbor, a mistake. But as I slowly unlatched the lock and pulled the door open, I felt it before I saw it. The presence of something waiting just outside. And then I looked down. Another box, identical to the first. Plain brown cardboard, unmarked except for my name, written in that same deliberate, looping handwriting. My stomach twisted, nausea creeping up my throat. I didn't want to open it. I already knew what was inside. Still, my hands moved on their own, lifting the box, bringing it inside, setting it down on the work table beside the first. My fingers trembled as I reached for the flaps, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I peeled back the cardboard. The smell hit me again. Chemical, sterile, but beneath it, something faintly sweet, like decay trying to claw its way through preservation. I forced myself to look. The second head stared up at me. This one different, yet the same in all the ways that mattered. Perfectly preserved, the skin smooth and untouched, the expression frozen in something unreadable. But this time, the lips were slightly parted in something that could almost be a scream. I stumbled back, my breath ragged, bile rising in my throat. It wasn't just the horror of what I was seeing. It was the realization that whoever had done this, whoever had sent these to me, was moving faster than I had anticipated. The first had arrived only last night. The second had come before I could even process the first. And if the note was right, there would be more. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles ached, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I forced myself to keep looking at what had been left for me. The second head, identical in its preservation to the first, rested in the box with the same careful placement, the same grotesque attention to detail. But this one was different in a way that sent an even colder shiver through me. Where the first had been frozen in an eerie, almost serene expression, this one had been sculpted into something else entirely. A face contorted in the silent echo of a scream, mouth parted just enough to suggest a final moment of terror, preserved in a way that made it seem like the emotion had been intentionally chosen. I turned away, pressing a shaking hand to my mouth, my stomach twisting violently as the smell of embalming fluid and something far worse filled the room. My mind refused to accept the reality of what was happening, the logical part of me desperately trying to construct an explanation that made sense. But there was none. Someone had sent these to me. Someone had chosen me specifically, had decided I was meant to see them like this, to understand something that I wasn't sure I wanted to. The weight of the second package settled over me like a suffocating fog, pressing against my ribs, making it harder to breathe. I had planned to meet Julian, had been ready to hand this nightmare over to him, to let him take control, but now I felt paralyzed, trapped between the overwhelming need to get away from these things and the horrifying certainty that I couldn't leave them behind. My phone buzzed against the table, jolting me back to reality, the sharp sound cutting through the thick silence like a blade. I grabbed it without thinking, my fingers fumbling as I lifted it to my ear. "Julian," I managed, my voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper. His voice came through clear, though there was an edge to it now, the same sharpness I had heard when he was dealing with cases that refused to make sense. "I'm downstairs," he said, and I could hear the faint noise of the street behind him, the distant murmur of traffic, the city still moving even as my world had ground to a halt. "Where are you?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Inside," I said, glancing again at the two boxes sitting side by side on the table, their contents waiting, watching. I have something you need to see." There was a pause on the other end, just long enough for me to know he had heard the unsteadiness in my voice. Then, "Buzz me in." I moved on instinct, barely aware of my own body as I pressed the button to unlock the door downstairs. then stood motionless, waiting, listening for the sound of his footsteps. It didn't take long before I heard the heavy knock at my door, firm, reassuring, cutting through the fear that had wrapped itself around my ribs. I opened it without hesitation. Julian stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over me first, taking in whatever expression I was wearing before his eyes moved to the table, to the two boxes sitting there in the too bright glow of the overhead lamp. His face barely changed, but I saw the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his shoulders squared as he stepped forward. "What the hell, Adrian?" he muttered more to himself than to me, as he moved closer, his fingers already reaching for the latex gloves tucked into his jacket pocket. Years of working homicide had trained him to approach death with detachment, to assess before reacting, but even he wasn't immune to the unnatural stillness of the room. I stood back, watching as he pulled on the gloves, as he crouched slightly to get a better look at the second head, his eyes scanning every detail with the precision of someone who had seen too many bodies in too many conditions. "Who sent these?" His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of something else beneath it, something tense, something restrained. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice raw. "They just arrived. First the one, last night, then the second, this morning. No return address, no explanation, just a note." I reached for the small envelope that had come with the second package, holding it out to him with fingers that barely felt like my own. He took it, his brow furrowing as he unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the words. "He is the first," he read aloud, then looked back at me. "But not the last." My stomach twisted again as I forced myself to meet his gaze. "What does this mean?" He exhaled slowly, setting the note down beside the boxes before looking back at the heads, his fingers resting just on the edge of the cardboard, as if debating whether to touch them. "It means," he said after a long pause, "that whoever did this isn't finished." The words sent a sharp, cold bolt of dread through me. "Julian," I whispered, unable to keep the tremor from my voice. "Who are they? Why me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he straightened, pulling off his gloves, his expression unreadable. "We need to get these to the lab," he said finally. "Find out how they were preserved, if there's any trace evidence, anything that could tell us where they came from." I nodded, too numb to argue. But just as he reached for his phone to call in a team, another sound interrupted the thick silence of the room. A soft, deliberate knock at the door. I went rigid. Julian turned sharply, his entire body tensing, in a way I had only seen when he was about to draw his weapon. He held up a hand, signaling for me to stay back, then moved slowly, cautiously toward the door. He peered through the peephole. Then, without a word, he unlatched the lock and pulled the door open. I couldn't see who was there at first, but I saw the moment Julian's entire demeanor changed. The way his shoulders stiffened, his fingers twitching slightly as if resisting the instinct to reach for his gun. I stepped forward, just enough to see past him. A woman stood in the hallway. Dark hair, pale skin, eyes too bright, too knowing, and in her hands, another box. She smiled, and then, in a voice that sent ice through my veins, she spoke. "It's time for you to finish your masterpiece, Adrian." The world tilted, and I knew. I was never meant to reconstruct the faces. I was meant to complete them.